Audiobook of Contrasting Identities, Navigating Identity Politics Conversations. Chapter 5. Judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. MLK misinterpreted. Judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. MLK misinterpreted. Critics of IP have cited Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, "I Have a Dream," where he says, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a world where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." This quote has been used to suggest that King desired a purely colorblind society, one where African Americans would not self-identify as being black, and would not make any claims from that position. An example of this is an article by Arthur Trenkoff titled, "Has Identity Politics Shattered Martin Luther King's Dream?" In the article, Trenkoff, 2018, says, "King asks us to see that color is only skin deep, and to get to the measure of a fellow human being, we need to try to peer deeper and harder into the mind, the heart and the soul of a person. I think he would be loath to generalize about black and white, men and women, or any other group as a whole as good or bad, victims and perpetrators, saints and sinners, racists and unprejudiced. Sadly, by twisted logic, those who, like him, try to preach colorblindness are now more often than not called out as racists, or at best naive." This interpretation contradicts beliefs explicitly mentioned by King. In King's speech, "Where Do We Go From Here?", he calls for African Americans to be proud of being black, not to ignore its existence, where he says, 1967, "Where do we go from here? First, we must massively assert our dignity and worth. We must stand up amid a system that still oppresses us and develop an unassailable and majestic sense of values. We must no longer be ashamed of being black. The job of arousing manhood within a people have been taught for so many centuries that they are nobody is not easy. Even semantics have conspired to make that which is black seem ugly and degrading. In Roget's thesaurus, there are some 120 synonyms for blackness, and at least 60 of them are offensive. Such words as blot, soot, grim, devil, and foul. And there are some 134 synonyms for whiteness, and all are favorable, expressed in such words as purity, cleanliness, chastity, and innocence. A white lie is better than a black lie. The most degenerate member of a family is the black sheep. Ossie Davis has suggested that maybe the English language should be reconstructed so that teachers will not be forced to teach the Negro child 60 ways to despise himself, and thereby perpetuate his false sense of inferiority, and a white child 134 ways to adore himself, and thereby perpetuate his false sense of superiority. The tendency to ignore the Negro's contribution to American life and strip him of his personhood is as old as the earliest history books and as contemporary as the morning's newspaper. To offset this cultural homicide, the Negro must rise up with an affirmation of his own Olympian manhood. Any movement for the Negro's freedom that overlooks this necessity is only waiting to be buried. As long as the mind is enslaved, the body can never be free. Psychological freedom, a firm sense of self-esteem, is the most powerful weapon against the long night of physical slavery. No Lincolnian Emancipation Proclamation, no Johnsonian Civil Rights Bill can totally bring this kind of freedom. The Negro will only be free when he reaches down to the inner depths of his own being and signs with the pen and ink of assertive manhood his own Emancipation Proclamation. And with a spirit strained toward true self-esteem, the Negro must boldly throw off the manacles of self-abnegation and say to himself and to the world, "I am somebody. I am a person. I am a man with dignity and honor. I have a rich and noble history, however painful and exploited that history has been. Yes, I was a slave through my foreparents, and now I am not ashamed of that. I am ashamed of the people who were so sinful to make me a slave. Yes, yes, we must stand up and say, I am black, but I am black and beautiful. This self-affirmation is the black man's need made compelling by the white man's crimes against him. From reading this part of the speech, King clearly is advocating for African Americans to reclaim what it means to be black in the United States and to own and acknowledge their history, not to advocate for being colorblind. When King was talking about being judged by your character, he was talking about being judged negatively, assuming someone to be of negative character based on their skin color and nothing else. This is, however, not in any way inconsistent with suggesting that being black has its own history in contrast to being white, and that this has played a role on the life chances of being black as opposed to being white. Furthermore, King also stressed disadvantages associated with being black in contrast with other disadvantaged groups, something contemporary IP critics would dismiss as oppression Olympics. In an interview with Sander Vanneker, he says, NBC, 1967, "White America must see that no other ethnic group has been a slave on American soil. That is one thing that other immigrant groups haven't had to face. The other thing is that the color became a stigma. American society made the Negro's color a stigma, and that can never be overlooked. So I think these things are absolutely necessary. The other thing is that Americans freed the slaves in 1863 through the Emancipation Proclamation of Abraham Lincoln, but gave the slaves no land, nothing in reality as a matter of fact to get started on. At the same time, America was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant there was a willingness to give the white peasants from Europe an economic base, and yet it refused to give the black peasants from Africa, who came here involuntarily in chains and had worked free for 244 years, any kind of economic base. So the Emancipation Proclamation from the Negro was really freedom to hunger. It was freedom to the winds and rains of heaven. It was freedom without food to eat or land to cultivate, and therefore it was freedom and famine at the same time. And when white Americans tell the Negro to lift himself by his own bootstraps, they don't look over the legacy in slavery and segregation. I believe we ought to do all we can, and seek to lift ourselves by our own bootstraps. But it is a cruel jest to tell a bootless man to lift himself by his own bootstraps. These arguments made by King are entirely consistent with the criteria for IP. He advocated for African Americans to unite together to combat their disadvantage and oppression through their shared experiences as African Americans, as well as reclaiming their identity of being black as something to be proud of instead of being ashamed of. And there is nothing in these arguments that suggests King's desire for a colorblind society. In fact, as noted in the last quote, King argued that white Americans, ignoring the differences between black Americans and white immigrants, ignores the specific disadvantages that exist within those groups. You may have noticed the significantly large quotes by King I've used in this chapter. However, I feel this was necessary to force the point about what King's views actually were, since it seems to be a popular rhetorical tactic at present to cite one sentence from a 17-minute speech to argue that King would have hated IP. Furthermore, these quotes are particularly useful since they were made after the Civil Rights Act. This challenges possible objections that the points made by King were merely issues pre-Civil Rights era. It is for this reason the narrative of the colorblind society, although well-meaning, indirectly maintains a status quo rooted in racism. This has come to be known as colorblind racism, which is explained by M.T. Williams, 2011, as when it is used to reduce race-related issues into individual problems. This results in being either unaware or ignoring the specific nature disadvantage based on race. And that this unawareness is a privilege of those who are in the dominant race because they can adopt the colorblind position, since they are not the ones disadvantaged on the basis of their race. This is the very thing King pointed out in his response to white immigrants having it tough as well. He explicitly said that white America cannot ignore the historical context of African Americans. Hence, cherry-picking one line from King's I Have a Dream speech to suggest that he would be against IP flies in the face of his actual statements regarding African Americans. With the views of MLK Jr. now addressed, I will now discuss how IP ought to be understood with discussions on freedom of speech.